Welcome to the 8th fiction in our 15 Fictions for Summer series. Today, I'm talking about H.G. Wells's The Time Machine, which is about so much more than just time travel. I think in some ways that Wells's Time Machine is a kind of companion piece to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It was written and published 9 years later in 1895. We know that H.G. Wells read a lot of Robert Louis Stevenson. He was one of Wells's favourite authors. The books are very similar lengths, novellas really rather than novels, about 100 pages. You can read them in an afternoon. Wells was just turning 30 when he wrote his. Robert Louis Stevenson was a bit older. But in both cases, they very deliberately wanted to write a story that would make a splash. They wanted a book that would sell, get them a bigger audience. And in both cases, therefore, they chose to write a genre book. So in Stevenson's case, the genre was Gothic horror, essentially, to which he gave a legendary twist, the twist being the horror is inside the man. In Wells's case, the genre was not horror. It was the imperial adventure story, the story of a plucky man who goes off on his travels and comes back with a extraordinary tale to tell. The twist in this case being that the travel is not lateral. It's not side to side from England to Africa or wherever. It is temporal. It is from 1895 into the future and then back to tell the story. But the form of the story would be very familiar to Wells's readers. This was a tale of adventure. The setup of the two books is actually really similar. So in both cases, it starts as the story of a group of men, and these are very masculine books in their very different ways. I don't think Wells's book has got any gay or homoerotic undertones at all. He was a grimly, remorselessly heterosexual writer and man. But in both cases, this is the story of a very male world, a very small world, a coterie of friends, essentially, who have in their midst someone who they don't really trust, who's up to something. And this is a man, he's not named in The Time Machine. So in The Time Machine, he's just called the Time Traveller. In Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, it is Dr. Jekyll. This man lives a respectable life. He lives alone. There are no women except female servants. There are servants who, you wonder, are they in on this or not? And he has in his house, in the back, a place where he's conducting some experiments, some weird experiments, and his friends don't really trust him or necessarily believe him as to what's going on. They know something's up, but they don't really know what it is. And in the course of these books, you go from the outside account to the inside account. So in The Time Machine, to start with, a narrator who is a kind of H.G. Wells figure tells the story of the gathering of this group of friends to hear tales of what's going on in the back room. What is the experiment that's being conducted? They are very skeptical. Some of them are outright disbelievers. And they say, we don't trust you. We've never trusted you. But then you get the inside account. So in the case of The Time Machine, it's not a confession as it is with Dr. Jekyll. It's a kind of testament, though. It is the story of the adventure. It is the traveller's tale. He has been to a place that no one else has been to, and he comes back to tell of what he has seen. And you have to take it on trust. There is no evidence. There is a little bit of evidence, but there is no real evidence that what he is saying is true. There are hints and there are revelations. Like in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, some of the characters get to see something of the truth of this, but others have to take it on trust, and they don't all trust it. And at the end of this story, at the end of both tales, the narrator's tales, not the inside tale, the protagonist disappears, and it's not completely clear where he has gone. It's not completely clear what's happened to Jekyll and Hyde, except it's over. In the case of the time traveller goes off on another travel and he never comes back. He goes to the journey from which there is no return. What is that journey? Who knows? Is it death? Who knows? The setup is similar. The shape of the book is similar. The lengths are similar. And so is the central theme. The central theme of The Time Machine is of a split in the human condition. In the case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the split happens in a single person, inside a single man. In the case of The Time Machine, the split is in the species, or as Wells might say, in the race, the human race. So this is not the story of what might happen to one person. It is the story of what might happen to the species as a whole. But the split that arrives is recognizably parallel to what happens in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The human race splits in two, and the two parts are light and dark, perhaps innocence and evil, not good and evil, but innocence and evil. The two sides of what it means to be human come apart, but they come apart in a single form, because this is still a single race, a single species, but it's a single species that has come literally in two. It is disembodied in two forms. That is the story that H.G. Wells tells, and I'm convinced in his own mind he saw it as an extension of, or a parallel to, Jekyll and Hyde. More of that later. There are, of course, though, lots and lots of differences. It's a very different kind of story. It's a time traveller story. It's not a Gothic horror. One of the differences, Wells is a very different kind of writer, is that unlike Robert Louis Stevenson, he goes quite a long way to try and explain the science. So in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, you're not really meant to believe or care how it happens. There are potions. Mysterious things go on in private gentlemen's laboratories. God knows what they're up to. And very strange and occult things happen. It is essentially occult in that story. In The Time Machine, Wells wants you to think it's at least plausible as science. And so he has the time traveller, before he tells the story of what he has seen on his journey, try to explain to his very skeptical audience, made up of men who don't have a name. None of them are given a name, but they're all given a type or a character. So one is described as a provincial mayor and another as a newspaper editor. There's a man of business. These are all men of the world. These are all men who don't believe tall tales. It's their business, in part, to see through tall tales. And so the time traveller has to persuade them that what he's doing is not just some mystical thing. It is something that they can recognize in the language that they all share, which is the language of empiricism and science. And so the time traveller says, if you think about it, what I'm going to tell you isn't that weird. I'm going to tell you that I can travel in time, but you need to think about time differently, because you probably all think that time is this separate category in which travel is impossible, but it's not. And the phrase that he uses, which is one that Wells has taken from the not exactly scientific discourse of the age, but what surrounded the scientific discourse of the age, is that time should be understood as the fourth dimension. So that phrase had started to be used. Time is a fourth dimension. It can be compared to the other three dimensions. So the other three dimensions, which are side to side, front to back, up to down, the space in which we move. Time is just another one. Time is forward and back in time. It is linear, it is directional, and therefore, in theory at least, the direction of travel can change. And the time traveller, I think that is effectively in this case Wells, tells his audience, if you stop and think about it and try to imagine what time travel means, it's not that weird, because it isn't that different from the other kinds of travel that we're now familiar with. Because, as he says, we're living in an age now where we've got used to vastly accelerated travel in the other dimensions. We think we can't travel in time because we just haven't developed the machinery yet. We don't have a sophisticated understanding in the same way, and this is the language that Wells would use, in the same way that if we were a more primitive people, we wouldn't understand or indeed believe in the kind of travel in the other dimensions that we as an advanced people have got used to. So he says to his audience, you already travel in time. You know you do. You go back and you go forward. You project forward in your own mind. You imagine future states. Also, more often, you go back in time. So you can shut your eyes and you can take yourself back to a period in your own childhood. You can remember things and you can place yourself back in that situation. What is that, he says, if it's not traveling in time? We all do it, but we can't do much of it, and we can't do it in any kind of sophisticated way because we lack the machinery. He says we're like human beings who can only move through the other dimensions according to their bodily capacities. So a human being can only jump a few feet off the ground. That's it. There is no other option. The up-down is up a tiny bit, or you might dig a hole. That's as far as you're going to go. Until, he says, we invented the machinery, the balloons, and soon the planes that would take us off the ground. But he's thinking at this point of the balloons. And he says traveling in a balloon up into space would seem miraculous to someone who believed that human travel up and down was limited to a few feet. So if we invent the machine that can travel in time, it will seem miraculous to us, but it is no more miraculous than the machine that lifts us off the Earth and up into the sky. It's just we haven't seen it yet. We haven't encountered it yet. So if we think of the fourth dimension, which we know is real because we know we can move in time because we do it in our heads all the time, and then annex that idea to what we are familiar with in the other dimensions, which is vastly accelerated and vastly enhanced capacity to travel if we can just get into the right machine, up and down or cross space quickly, the railways and all the other things that hurtle people through space. If we can imagine doing that in time and draw the parallel, we won't think it's occult or weird. We will understand it is just travel in the fourth dimension. Some of this, as it's described, is incredibly quaint. And there's something quite literal-minded about this book, maybe about the time traveler himself, or Wells, if Wells is the person thinking the thoughts of the time traveler. He more or less imagines that this machine will be like a kind of early motor car. The motor car had just been invented at this time. This is something that's going to move through time in the way that other machines were helping human beings to move quickly through space. It's not described in any detail, and partly I have in my mind the version from the 1960 film, which is a kind of car, a sort of late Victorian Edwardian car. But it's described in the book more or less in those terms. It's got a lever, you push the lever forwards, and it will speed you up through time. And then there is a measuring device in this machine, which is like a mileometer, which just tells you how far you've gone. It tells you in years rather than in miles where you are. And it's all very directional. You will travel to a point in the future. You will stop and you will have arrived somewhere 1,000 years, 10,000 years, 100,000 years on. And then you will travel back by pulling the lever the other way. And the harder you pull it, the faster it goes until you get back to your original location. It's like getting into a car and driving into the future. It's more or less portrayed in those terms. And so it feels like an imagined version of travel, which is very 1895. At the same time, as Wells himself said later on, when he wrote about the time machine, which he more or less disowned as a mature writer as the work of someone who was a bit juvenile, and he's a bit embarrassed by it. He wrote a preface to it for a republication, I think it was 30 years later, in which he said, this is clearly the work of someone who hasn't quite worked out yet what it is to be a writer. Some of the writing is a bit pedestrian. Some of this hasn't properly been thought through, he says. But my God, I was ahead of my time when it comes to thinking about time, because look at what's been discovered by science, by physics, by Einstein. Relativity. Time is a much stranger thing than anyone could possibly have understood in 1895. It is relative. It is possible to experience time at very, very different speeds depending on where you are in the universe. Time does depend not just on something rigid and fixed, where it is limited by human capacity to move. It depends on a whole host of other factors that shape direction and travel and speed in ways that go well beyond the narrowness of our human imagination or understanding of what time can be. And actually, were Wells to have lived longer, he would have found that the physics of time had got weirder and weirder and weirder. Relativity is nothing compared to quantum physics, where time loses its directionality altogether. I mean, this is way above my pay grade, but my understanding of it is that the idea that time has a direction, that there is a past, present, and future, is itself, when seen from a deep understanding of the physical universe, an illusion. It's just a human construct. We, in order to bear to exist in this universe, have created for ourselves a fictional understanding of how the world works, which suggests that we move through time from past to present to future. All of that is simply a construct that serves our purposes so that we don't go mad, because if we really knew how time worked, we wouldn't be able to cope with it. It moves in all sorts of different directions. It is very, very fluid. Nothing about it and nothing about our place in it physically is fixed. Now, Wells is still thinking in linear terms. His is a very literal-minded linear account of what time is. But he does say later on in his writing career, the thing that I was right about was that Anyone who says there's science and then there's this kind of mystical nonsense had no idea just how weird and mystical science was going to get. When the time traveler tells his skeptical, worldly audience of men that he's invented this machine, they mock him, they doubt him, they hear the fourth dimension account, and they smile. It's a nice story. But then they also say, well, if this machine does exist, what are you going to do with it? And being prosaic men of the world, they say what they would do with it. If I had a time machine, the newspaper editor says, I would want to go into next week and, I quote from the book, find out what's going to happen to little Rosebery. And that's a reference to the then Prime Minister, Rosebery, who had called an election in May of 1895, which is when Wells was writing this book. And the newspaper editor wants to know, will he win the election? That's what I would use my time machine for, he says. And I think that's a fairly standard human response. I want to know what's going to happen next week. One of the business people says, well, if you've got a time machine, I want to get in it and go into the future and grab the benefits, the rewards of my investments now. I want to go into a future where the things that I have invested in pay their rewards so I can access them immediately because I don't want to have to wait 20 years for the payoff of my investments, which is a slightly weird take on this. So I think a lot of people, when they hear about a time machine, think, right, I know how I'd make money out of the time machine. I would go into the future, find out which are the investments that did pay off, which are the companies that exploded. If you did it now, go into the future and find out which are the technology companies that have actually cracked AI and are worth whatever it is. Or if it was 20, 30 years ago, you go into the future, discover what Amazon is worth, go back and buy early stock in Amazon. You go to the future, find out what happens, and then go back and invest in the future. But this man is saying, I'm very confident in my investments. I just want to speed up the payoff of these investments, which is, among other things, evidence that this was an age that was not worried about inflation, because I think a lot of people would think, well, you could go 20 years into the future, but actually inflation would have eaten away the benefits of your investments. This was, among other things, the age of the gold standard, deflation, not inflation. So this complacent, pompous man thinks, I'm getting a good return on my capital, but my God, I'd like to have 20 years worth of return tomorrow. To which the narrator, the H.G. Wells character, says, be careful what you wish for. Not, it might all have inflated away, but you might arrive in the future and find out that actually this society has gone communist. In which case, your private property is no longer your own. Don't be so complacent and assume that from now to whatever point you think you can reap your rewards is something that is linear in that way. Anything could happen. And I think that's also a pretty common human response. I think a lot of people would imagine if they had a time machine, they would like to know what the world looks like in 20 years' time, or in 50 years' time, or in 100 years' time. And that's what the worldly men who listen to the traveller's tale before he's told it, they've listened to his tale about what machine he has out back, say they would like to do with it. And this is all to emphasize just how different a kind of man the time traveler is, because he is, and this is by far the weirdest thing about him, he is not interested in next week or next year or next decade or next century or next millennium. He gets into his machine, he tries it out, and the first thing that he wants to do is push the lever as far as it will go, for as long as it will go, effectively, more or less, and go into the deep, deep, deep future. He wants to know not the story of what will happen to human societies and human economies and human experience in the short run or the medium run or the long run, but in the very, very, very long run. He is interested in getting to the end of the story of human evolution. And he doesn't want to stop anywhere before he arrives at a place of which it is possible to say, this is somewhere so far beyond where we are now, we can see how the human experience has genuinely evolved. That's what he wants to do. And he's not interested in anything else. So he gets into his machine and he goes into the distant, distant future. H.G. Wells had written a version of this story a couple of years earlier. He wrote a parody piece of newspaper journalism in 1893 called The Man of the Year Million. It's speculation about what it might mean to be human a million years from now. Now, a million years is an awfully long time. It is unimaginably far ahead. It's not unheard of for that kind of speculation to take hold at various points. We are actually weirdly now in the third decade of the 21st century living through a period where that kind of speculation is also quite rife, particularly in Silicon Valley. There is talk in certain circles in the existential risk community and the effective altruism community about the need to think very, 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 very long term about what life might be like in a million years' time, on the grounds that human beings spend far too much time worrying about not just next week and next month and next year, but next decade or next century. Whereas if the human species has a long life ahead of it, there is so much more beyond that that we should be thinking about. And if we do something terrible or catastrophic now, we could screw up, never mind skew, but screw up the whole million-year story. Wells is not interested in that kind of existential risk speculation. This is before the age of those machines, including nuclear weapons that might kill us all, or indeed the killer robots that might kill us all. But he is interested in the idea of evolution in the very long run. And in that half-joking, half-serious article, he or his protagonist speculates that what's going to happen as human beings progress is that the thing that will evolve, as it was already evolving, was human intelligence or cognitive capacity or brain power. And the thing that wouldn't evolve and actually probably would go backwards, as it was already starting to go backwards, was physical power and physical capacity. So even at the end of the 19th century, Wells is effectively saying, look at us human beings, the most, quote unquote, advanced among us, thinking that Western societies were the advanced ones. The most advanced among us are becoming weaker and weaker physically. Look at the intellectuals. Look at the people who are the brainwork power behind social progress and human development. They're not getting physically stronger. They're sitting at desks. They're working away at their calculations. They're inventing things in dark, out-of-the-way rooms. They don't see much daylight. No one can believe that the human race is progressing physically, not the advanced bits of it, but it is progressing intellectually or cognitively. So where is that story going to end? Project it forward all the way, he says, and we will end up as a species just as brains. The bodies will wither away altogether. And he speculates that the future, the long-term future for the human race, is to become, to use a more contemporary phrase, brains in a vat. We're just going to be brains floating in the fluid that keeps the brain going because the body won't be needed by then. Long ago, the body will have been dispensed with. And the moral of that story is if we end up as brains in a vat, on the one hand, this is the pinnacle of development. We're just brains, super brains. On the other hand, a brain in a vat is incredibly vulnerable. A brain in a vat is a fragile thing. In a way, it's a feeble thing. It's a hopeless thing. The story of evolution seems to be separating out the two parts of the human experience, the physical, the bodily, and the intellectual and the cognitive. And if they really come apart, what you will be left with is something whose superpower is also its utter vulnerability. And in The Time Machine, he offers a version of that story, but it's different because it is not speculating about a separating out of the mind and the body. It is speculating about, much more like Jekyll and Hyde, a separation of two kinds of body. The time traveler arrives not in the year million, but I'm going to have to look this up now because I can never remember what the number is. It is the year 802,701. Crazy number, crazy year. That's a long way ahead. He puts the brakes on his machine in the year 800,000, effectively. He speeds through all the stuff that we might be interested in, and he gets out of his machine, and it hasn't moved in space. So it is still where he was in 1895, which is effectively somewhere in southwest London. It's Wimbledon. And part of Wells's weird genius is to set his crazy stories in very, very recognizable places, like the War of the Worlds, which is in Bromley and Ruislip, I think. And this is Wimbledon and Kensington. And it hasn't moved at all. The point is, it's moved in one dimension, but not the other three. So he's in Wimbledon in the year 800,000. And it's a weird place. It's green, and most of the buildings have disappeared, apparently. But there are relics, and there are odd statues, and there are hills, and there are strange, symbolic pieces of human architecture that don't seem to have a function. And it's hot. It's much hotter. And the reason it's much hotter is the sun seems to be much closer. So Wells believed, or maybe the traveler believed, that the long-term story of the solar system was, on the one hand, that the sun was going to get colder because things decay. But on the other hand, things were going to get closer together. It was going to collapse in on itself, so the sun would also get nearer. So in this far distant future, the Earth is a planet with a much closer, although somewhat cooler sun, but so much closer that the temperature is much higher. So this is a hotter place. And it's inhabited by these strange creatures whom the time traveler calls the Eloi, who are clearly in some way human, but they are odd. They are stunted and small, so these are little creatures. They are innocent seeming. They are elfin. They are like little creatures from a fairy tale. They seem oddly sexless. They're extremely friendly. They don't seem to have any particular productive activities that they're involved in. So he emerges into a world where, as he says, there aren't any of the things that he'd become familiar with. There don't seem to be any shops. There don't seem to be, as he says, any advertisements or obvious means of transportation. Sort of modernity has vanished somehow. What there are these little creatures playing games and picking flowers. It's, depending on your taste, either idyllic or nightmarish. I kind of think of it when I try and picture it, which I find quite hard. And again, I'm probably prejudiced by the 1960 film, but it sort of feels like the cover of some awful late 1960s prog rock album, a kind of landscape, a green landscape of hills and monuments with little weird creatures in it, with flowers playing games. That's what he discovers. So what's happened? He concludes that what has happened is this is where evolution is heading. Because, as he says in his late Victorian progressive way, the development of the human race depends on hardship and contest. He has a sort of survival of the fittest mentality. And the time that the time traveler has come from is one in which the tough will survive and the tough will come up with new ways of surviving and prospering. And there is a relationship in the world that he's left behind between progress and difficulty or hardship. But as hardships are overcome by these powerful, strong, tough-minded people, as human beings get better and better at dealing with, ameliorating, and in the end, eradicating the hardships, the incentive to develop disappears. There is nothing to drive human progress. What there is are human beings detached from basic fears and needs, living lives of, as he says, contentment and probably even luxury, and they will atrophy. It's, I think, a classic late Victorian fear that there is a point in progress. And it's not just late Victorian. All societies have had a version of this, that as we get really sophisticated and good at what we do, we lose the incentive to keep improving and we go backwards. Or we end up relying on a version of this life which doesn't demand anything of us. And so we become these kind of undemanding, complacent creatures. And in this case, undemanding, complacent, little, innocent. That's what he finds. And the time traveler thinks, well, is this a good news story or a bad news story? It's a bit of both. On the one hand, it looks like we did work out how to live a life where nothing is demanded of us except what we feel like doing. And these creatures seem to want to pick flowers. They don't seem to have families. The family, one of the engines of progress, has vanished. The living is communal. But it's communal without any edge to it. It's not competitive in any way. These people do not seem to have any productive activities. He's not at all clear exactly how they feed themselves or clothe themselves. But it's as though all of that was worked out a long time ago and all they do is just exist. And so he thinks, well, that's weird, but if that's how it's going to end, that's how it's going to end. Could be worse. And then he discovers that it is a lot worse because these aren't the only creatures. These are the creatures of the light. These are the creatures of the day. These are the creatures of the warm sunshine. And he discovers there's another set of creatures who are also clearly at some level, if not recognizably human, an extension of the human story. And these are the creatures of the night, the creatures who live below ground, the productive creatures, because these are the creatures actually who live in a world underground, which is a world of industrial machinery. But also a very sinister world in which towards the end he sees that one of the things that they do in their underground world is perform what look like sacrifices. And in the end, he thinks the only thing that they can possibly be sacrificing on their altars are the people of the light, the little Eloi, who when they get captured, get taken underground and ritually slaughtered. It's a nightmarish world underground. These are the Morlocks. These are the humans who have evolved, if evolved is the word, in a bestial way. They have become more and more animal-like. They live in darkness. These are the extensions of that part of late Victorian political imagination that sees human beings getting trapped by and almost annexed to industrial machinery. There's something sinister and industrial going on underground, but it doesn't see the light of day. None of the products seem to see the light of day. There are two worlds here. These worlds are not in competition with each other. They are separate worlds. They only really overlap when occasionally some of the little creatures of the light get sucked down into the darkness. And now it is clearly a miserable story. And it's a terrifying story because human evolution has evolved to include the worst of us. Indeed, it's a very depressing story because the best of us, if that's what the Eloi are, is a pretty uninspiring version of human progress. If this is all to turn us into little skipping, prancing, game-playing, half-child, half-human, sexless nothings, that's bad enough. But then there are the creatures who gobble them up in the night. And the traveller says, or Wells says in the story, it's clear what this is an extension of. So he doesn't leave it up to the reader to decide what is this a allegory for or even a metaphor for. He says this is clearly the extension of the contest that we have already started to see in the year 1895, which is the separation out of the classes. This is about human classes going their separate ways. Or, as he says, the separation out of capital and labour. At the time that the time traveller comes from, the end of the 19th century, he says it was already clear to us back then that human beings were living different kinds of lives depending on what kind of class they belonged to, where they were in the social hierarchy. And the separation was getting more and more pronounced, and it was physical. And some of it was literally a moving up towards the light or down under the ground. So the traveller says, I left behind a world, almost the turn of the 20th century, which was in part an underground world. There was this thing called the Underground in London. People travelled underground. Shops were moving underground. Various kinds of productive enterprises were moving underground. Workers were being taken underground to work underground. And he says even the people who lived above ground, the poor people in London, were living a dark kind of life in the East End of London. Many people rarely saw the light. There was so much pollution. There was so much smog. There was so much moving from dark building to dark building. And this was a completely separate kind of existence from the existence of the people who were benefiting from the labour of the underground men and women. The capitalists, the brain workers, the intellectuals who were living airier lives, lighter lives. Some of it was moving literally up into the sky, buildings being built higher and higher. Some human beings were being taken underground by the economic system, and some human beings, the people who were the beneficiaries of that system, were being lifted into the light. And this is clearly just the extension of that story. If you run it far enough forward, and it's an awfully long way that he thinks you have to go, you see the complete separating out of these two versions of the human experience. It's kind of weird because this story does require at a certain point, whatever the contest was between the classes, to have disappeared because, as I say, it's not a world of competition that the traveller arrives in. It's a world in which the two versions of the human, the Eloi and the Morlock, are completely separate in the lives that they live because each of them has become only able to survive in its own version of the human experience. The Morlocks do not dare go into the light. The Eloi do not dare go underground. At some point in the previous 800,000 years, the two have become completely separate, with the overlap only being the occasional moment of horror and sacrifice. But otherwise, these are versions of the human in which there is complete dependency on their environment, the one in which they found themselves. At some point, the underground people could no longer go into the light. At some point, the overground people, who no longer had any incentive to go underground, live this carefree life, this luxurious life that eventually becomes a kind of atrophied, empty, almost woodland creature-like life, utterly vulnerable. Like the brain in the vat, utterly vulnerable, but without the superpower of the brain in the vat. Both sides of this story are examples of the ultimate regression, that at the end of human progress, there will be a going back because past a certain point, the bits have to separate out. And once they separate out, there is no coming back together. And if they can't come back together, the thing that drives progress will cease. Wells thought that the thing that drives progress is the fact that the human contains both the light and the dark, the overground and the underground. And it's the contest between them that pushes the story on. Once there is no contest between them, there is no story. Nothing will change, nothing will advance, everything will decay. And the time traveler, when he finally gets back in his machine, has one more journey in mind, which is to the end of the line. He pushes the lever a bit further. He wants to find out what the ultimate end point of this story is. And he arrives in a place which is like the album cover of a sort of death metal band or something. It's black, it's dark, it's miserable, it's a horror show. There are absolutely no signs that there ever were human beings. There's slime. The sun is dead and cold and practically crashed into the earth. The creatures such as they exist are vast, amorphous. I think there's a crab. I think there's some kind of squid. It's hell. It's hell. The story ends in hell. And so he goes back to 1895 to tell his tale. Wells based this story on all sorts of different influences, and he's very open about them, including in the introduction he wrote many years later to a re-edition of the book. He says he was partly inspired by some of the late Victorian or mid-Victorian adventure stories, Rider Haggard's She about journeying into Africa, a story that was very notorious at the time by a lunatic writer called Bulwer Lytton, called The Coming Race, which was about an underground species. An adventurer discovers a species living underground who are primitive but also very virile. They have the life force flowing in them, as a version of mesmerism or animal magnetism. Somewhere underground, you find the people who have accessed the driving life force, and this is the coming race. These are the people who are going to take over the underground people. God knows what the psychoanalytic explanation of this is. The force he calls vril, V-R-I-L, which, if nothing else, is interesting because it gave its name to Bovril, the beef extract, which is named after the bovine, the beef, and vril, from this novel, the life force, Bovril, is meant to give you the force that will allow you eventually to take over. Wells is part inspired, part mocking these stories. But he says that he's really got two primary influences when he wrote The Time Machine. One is the work of Robert Louis Stevenson, who he says was his favorite writer. And I really do think that this is meant to be another version of the Jekyll and Hyde story, because in part it does answer a question that I posed in the last episode, which is that point in the Jekyll and Hyde story where Stevenson, or is it Jekyll, one or the other, says, I wonder what would have happened if I'd been a different kind of man, Jekyll, and I'd basically lived a life of pleasure-seeking and sensuality. And the part of me that was underdeveloped was the angelic part, the good part, the part that wanted to be good or at least to be decent. And so the potion had liberated that childlike version of me, that little creature inside me, if I'd been that kind of man, that had never really seen the light, but wanted to be respectable and decent in the world and good and innocent and pure. The angel, as Stevenson or Jekyll calls him, or calls it. What would that creature be? I think Wells tries to give the answer in this story. The Eloi are that creature. The Eloi are a kind of version of the angel that might have been released if Jekyll had been a different kind of man. Little, stunted, like Hyde is a shrunken version because he hasn't grown yet. They're almost adolescent, but they're sexless. They are very innocent. They are game-playing creatures. They have nothing to them. They have no side to them. The time traveler befriends one of them, a young woman or girl called Weena. Very creepy, but very, very sexless relationship. It's all innocence and it's all going nowhere. It's all a kind of nothing. It's a nothing version of the human. It's like a parody of innocence, of the angelic, because it has no point to it. The difference is that in the Stevenson story, the thing that is released is like that because it hasn't yet developed. Because whatever it is, whether it's Hyde, whether it's the fiend, or whether it's the angel, it has had to live away from the possibility of human development. So it is sort of adolescent, or even worse than that, it is kind of stunted. Whereas in the Wells story, this is what you get after all development has been completed. So the Eloi are not the version of the human that come out of us because it's never had a chance to grow. The Eloi are what you get if we grow and keep growing and keep growing and keep progressing and keep developing. In the end, we will turn back on ourselves, because past the point, Wells thinks, where we separate out the bestial, the raw, the virile, whatever it is, from the intellectual, the refined, the cultured, the luxurious. Once those two things are properly separated out, he thinks, the refined, the intellectual, the luxurious has no means of development. The thing that drives it on always is its connection, its intimate connection to something more real and more raw and more animal. And so what you get, he says, in the end, is a separation that leads to a reversion. We go back to become the Eloi, the angels, the little creatures, at the very end of the story, because that's where, he says, the story ends, not where it begins, as it does in the case of Hyde, but where it ends. The other book that Wells said was his prime inspiration when he wrote The Time Machine was the book that had been his favorite when he was a teenager. The writer who was his favorite writer, Swift, and the book is Gulliver's Travels. And The Time Machine is also inspired by, a kind of companion to, the fourth part of Gulliver's Travels, when Gulliver arrives in the land of the Houyhnhnms, or however you pronounce that unpronounceable word. I'm sure I haven't just pronounced it as I pronounced it in the Gulliver's Travels episode, but let's call them the Houyhnhnms. The elegant, sophisticated, rational, good horses, and their companion creatures in that world, the Yahoos, who are the bestial humans, the dirty, angry, aggressive, physically laboring, but intellectually stunted humans. The Yahoos and the Morlocks are almost interchangeable in those two stories. It is the human as beast, essentially. The human where whatever it is that encourages us to think we can be better than that we can become creatures who are different from the other animals because we are rational creatures, thinking creatures, caring creatures, moral creatures. This is the version of the human where that has been stripped away. In Gulliver, in Swift's story, that form of perfection or perfectibility is placed with creatures who are more elegant than we are. What the horses emphasize for Swift is that the human, particularly the human body, is a ridiculous vehicle for ambitions towards reason and perfection and truth, because we are grotesque. I mean, a lot of Gulliver's Travels is about just how ridiculous the human body is. Ridiculous, disgusting, but also weak and feeble and diseased, and nothing like what you would want a body to be that contained a mind or a thinking entity that was capable of these higher thoughts. The problem with the human condition is all of those thoughts are still stuck with that ridiculous body. If we were horses, we might well lead elegant and almost perfect lives, but we can't do it because of the stupid bodies, the ridiculous bodies that we're stuck with. That is the human condition. Our dreams are always undone by the absurdity of our physical form. Look at us on our two legs. The wind will blow us over with our stupid big heads and our big brains wobbling about. Who the hell do we think we are? And in a way, what Swift is saying is that this is the vanity of human progress. The vanity of human progress is that we try and dress up what we are as something that we're not. We behave as though we were as elegant as horses, whereas actually we're apes. I mean, he didn't know we were apes at that point. Turns out we are apes. But nonetheless, we are ape-like. And philosophy attached to an ape-like body, Swift thinks is ridiculous. So Gulliver's Travels is in part a story about the vanity of human progress. Wells writes the version which is about the futility of human progress, not the vanity, but the utter, ultimate pointlessness of it. Because if you take the story forward with an understanding of evolution, so Wells knows that we're apes, or were once apes, and you see that the primary thing that is going to happen, that has to happen for this story to keep moving forward, he thinks, is that part of us which is rational, which is capable of moral thought and of social organization and of progressive social improvements, that part of us has to increasingly be separated out from our weak or diseased or ridiculous or lustful or simply violent bodies, whatever it is that drives us in the bestial direction. The two things, for progress to be possible, Wells imagines, have to be separated out over time. That's part of the reason, this is a separate conversation, why he was a eugenicist. But if that separation continues, in the end, it becomes self-defeating. It must become self-defeating because past a certain point, it will no longer be possible for the thing that drove the separation to continue to drive it because the separation becomes pure. We do become the nearly perfect creatures. And when we are the perfect creatures, we are also the pointless creatures. We are the Eloi. We are the nothings. This is a story about the futility of human progress in the very, very, very long run. I think that what Wells is saying is if you think hard about human evolution, you know that it can't have a good ending. It might be brains in a vat, might be the Eloi and the Morlock. It might ultimately be the giant crab and the giant squid and the dead, cold sun squatting over the earth. It doesn't have a good outcome in the long, long, long run. But as Wells's fellow Fabian and fellow eugenicist, the economist John Maynard Keynes once said, in the long run, we are all dead. And even Wells, after he wrote The Time Machine, made it pretty clear that he wasn't so interested in that story. I mean, in a way, there's nothing all that shocking about the thought that if you take the story of time to the end of the line, and if you don't believe in salvation, then it's got to end badly. Because everything in the end comes to an end. I mean, where's the human race going to go, if not into the darkness? Wells himself, who wrote many, many, many different stories, some science fiction, many of them science fiction, some not, wrote extensively about politics. He wrote lots of things which were speculative about the future in a much more immediate way. He actually is much more like the other men at the beginning of The Time Machine. He wants to know what's going to happen next week. We all do, really. I mean, in our heart of hearts, we might think deep down we ought to be interested in the very, very long run future, but we're not. I mean, what's the point of thinking about the year 802,701? Frankly, who cares? What about, if not next week, and if not next year, I mean, next decade is quite hard to think about, and certainly 50 years ahead is quite hard to think about. And Wells wrote many of those kinds of stories too. Perhaps one of his best known, which was a work of essentially futurology, published nearly 40 years later, in 1933, was called The Shape of Things to Come. And this was Wells's attempt to map out the future, not over the next million years, but over the remainder of the 20th century, as seen from 1933. And that book has a reputation for being quite prophetic, that Wells, in a sort of way that The Time Machine, oddly, at least about some of the science, was a little bit eerily prophetic. The Shape of Things to Come has a reputation for having seen into the future. Because in 1933, Wells wrote about a world in which a Second World War was coming. Maybe that wasn't such a huge punt in 1933, but in 1933, there were many people who still believed that in the end, the experience of the First World War would frighten human beings off ever attempting a second. Wells said, don't you believe it? These forces are at work, not least the forces of capital. More and greater conflict is coming. In that war, he saw greater destruction. He saw new weapons of war. Mass bombing of civilians, the things that were to happen. He speculated about the arrival of nuclear weapons, of certain kinds of disease, including biological weapons. He speculated about a rapidly warming world. Some of it feels like he did see the future, but actually The Shape of Things to Come on the really big question was wrong. We know it was wrong because it never happened. The thing that he says is going to happen didn't happen, and I don't think it ever will happen. So the way Wells saw the future was that this terrible Second World War would drag on and on. The weapons would mean it was impossible to win it or lose it. It would become a kind of frozen conflict, like some of the conflicts in the world today. The sides were powerful enough to defend themselves, not powerful enough to defeat each other. And so it would lead to misery, immiseration, to economic stagnation, to economic decline. The world would become poorer, dirtier, more diseased. There would be pandemics. But it would be stuck because this conflict couldn't be resolved. There couldn't be a victory. And in the end, human beings, being ultimately, at least some of them, rational creatures, would arrive at the only possible solution. The only way you could escape from a world in which there was a never-ending Second World War, which is to create a world government. And so what actually has to happen is you do have to get the separating out of the rational, the perfectible, you might even say the moral, which is an organization of human society at a global level by well-intentioned people, essentially by Fabian socialists like H.G. Wells, who will organize things in a way to prevent such conflict, to restore the economy, to guard against these diseases, even to do things. One of Wells's obsessions in the shape of things to come is he thinks the world is heading towards a kind of tidal wave of pornography. One of the ways in which the bestial side might take over is that human beings are going to be swamped in pornography. If he thought that in 1933, God knows what he would think now. And in the end, you're going to need well-intentioned bureaucracy to rescue human beings from the things that will otherwise sweep over them. The worst of themselves will take over unless there can be organized, global, social harmony. And so at some point that will have to come. And at that point, I suppose you do get the start of the story, were it to happen, that Wells thinks ends as the time machine ends, the separating out. Some part of the human experience is pushed away or pushed down or even pushed underground. And there are certain human beings who rise above it and allow others to rise above it. And eventually, the conflict that Wells had believed was the driver of progress, but becomes impossible, becomes the enemy of progress because the conflict is frozen, gets eradicated. And you get a kind of perfection, but also presumably, if you run it over 800,000 years, a hollowing out of the human experience. Well, it's not going to happen because Wells was wrong about the conflicts of the 20th century. The Second World War did not become a frozen conflict. It did not produce economic decay. It did not lead to a pandemic, which meant that human beings could no longer fight nor give up the fight. It may be chance, this may be contingency, but I think there's enough evidence in human history that it's something more than that. The Second World War didn't only produce a decisive outcome and the defeat of at least one of the forms of social organization in the world in 1933, fascism, but it also was the engine of human progress, in the sense that the Second World War, like many wars, drove economic innovation, drove social organization. It led to the creation of essentially modern welfare states, the thing that the Fabians had always dreamed of. The First World War went some way to creating those things, but the Second World War sealed the deal. The Second World War also led to extraordinary technological innovation, not just in weaponry, but in communications, in transportation. It was, in Wells's terms, the engine of progress. So the shape of things to come seems to imagine that at some point in the 20th century, it will become clear that the human story is stuck because the things that we need to progress have become ensnared in a form of intractable conflict. And if it's not going to be socialist revolution that emancipates us, it's going to have to be world government, and maybe it can be both. Actually, what happened in the second half of the 20th century is that it didn't get stuck. It kept moving. And it kept moving because the two parts didn't come apart. The rational, the intellectual, the organized, the progressive, the social, and the violent, the bestial, the sexualized, the driven, the monstrous. Those two things carried on going together. The states that created the modern welfare state were the same states that also destroyed human beings on an industrial scale in the Second World War and beyond. The two sides of the human experience don't come apart, or at least they haven't come apart yet. Maybe they will. Maybe AI is the thing that will break them apart. Maybe we are going to become brains in a vat. Maybe there will come a point at which, and some people in Silicon Valley believe we're on the cusp of this, in which the thinking part of ourselves and the ridiculous, swift, Yahoo part of ourselves get totally separated out from each other. So there are elites who live forever and lead lives of Silicon Valley dream perfection. Maybe that's coming. I don't know. Hasn't happened yet, though. It hasn't happened yet. For now, something else remains true. Something remains true, which is the thing that Wells said in the long run can't be true. So it depends what you mean by the long run. But for now, at least, it is still true, which is that any attempt to imagine a version of the human story where the two parts, the two sides separate out from each other bodily, physically, into two kinds of bodies, two versions of who we are, two separate species, or the brain and the body get separated out. Any version that thinks they get separated out rather than that they always go together, anything that forgets there are always two sides to who we are, is a fantasy. To find out more about this series and this podcast, just visit our new website, ppfideas.com. Tomorrow, in our 15 Fictions for Summer series, it's another play, Bertolt Brecht's great anti-war drama, Mother Courage and Her Children.